All right, welcome back, everybody. Had a couple of weeks off of actual lecture, so it's nice to be back. Good to see you all. For this week, we read the first half of this essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. What did you guys think?
It's totally absurd.
It's totally absurd.
I don't understand why you chose this to study.
This book?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so we'll get into that. That'll be like the content of today.
And the first half, I swear he was drunk or high when he was trying to write it. It makes very little sense.
Sure.
The second half becomes a little better.
I just thought I was stupid. I'm a political science major. He's like referencing all these guys, and I just thought it just made me feel dumb. So,
Yeah, Ashley emailed me saying, like, look,
Well,
is this a common thing?
Is the best word for it.
Absurd.
Yes.
Yeah. Was this everybody's experience?
I don't even twice understand it.
Yeah.
I read really slow.
I could barely, I had to read it. After a while, I just was like, I gotta stop analyzing every sentence.
Eventually, so
Yeah, so how about online? What was y'all's reaction to the myth of Sisyphus? Nods, smiles.
I personally loved it. I thought like relating like life to like accepting the series of futile labors that one must go through as a part of life, and relating that to the absurd, I found really, really interesting. And then obviously Camus' views on suicide and the escape of the negative views by essentially believing that Sisyphus was happy throughout his futile labors. I thought you can kind of apply that to your life, where if you're like, oh, screw this, screw what I'm doing, it's just everything's repetitive or monotonous. You can say, well, those are the things that make life beautiful and what life is.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So it sounds like you ended up reading through the whole essay instead of the first half. So good. That's right. That's pretty much what Camus is getting at. Did anybody else like it? Looks like Olivia, you liked it.
I thought it was okay. I didn't understand a lot of it. But
sure.
I was agreeing to the sentiment that it was confusing in the chat.
So I promise that the myth of Sisyphus has a clear argument, that it is meaningful and contentful. It has a story that communicates all the way through the essay. However, it is okay and like incredibly common, and probably like just what is necessary given like what might be your background in philosophy, to think, as Dawood says, like, look, this is absurd. It makes no sense. It made me feel stupid, right? That there's just all of these people being referenced and stuff. The way that the existentialists argue, with maybe the exception of Sartre here and there, with existentialism as a humanism will be really clear. They are writing in a different tradition of philosophy than any of the philosophy that you have read for assignments in this department, and likely in just about any department, save maybe 4 or 5 in the United States. So this is called the continental tradition of philosophy, and the style and form of argument in continental philosophy is very different from what we expect in the tradition of philosophy, the analytic tradition that is taught here. So if this is your first exposure to a continental philosopher, so to speak, then it should be a muddled, obfuscated, confusing mess. Some advice for how to read this stuff is to your first pass, just like kind of glaze over, try to read it from a bird's eye view, right? Get as much of it in your head as you can, and it will become clear as you get through. At least you'll get layers of it. So every time I read the Myth of Sisyphus, I see new things, I learn new things. And it is, I promise, like an argument, and we'll like go through step by step what's happening in this essay. Now, another feature of the continental philosophers, and specifically Camus and his philosophical essays, is aesthetic and artistic flourish, right? So this is almost as much a work of poetry as it is a philosophical essay. Camus is weaponizing metaphor for the sake of argument, for the sake of inference. He elicits the reader's experience and emotion in order to make those inferences. And so if you're missing metaphors, or if those metaphors are unclear, the references are unclear, then it won't strike you at the heart with the emotion that is supposed to be essential to the mode of inference, from how you get from premise to conclusion, right? And this is kind of common of continental philosophers. Another feature of the continental philosopher is to invent concepts and terms to sort of expand and grow an idea from the point of intuition, to give it as much experience and context as you can. And so concepts become expansive in this way. And so this is why I say, like, try to read from a bird's eye perspective, right? Because it's from this bird's eye perspective that, at least at first passes, you tend to get what the intuition at the heart of a concept that's being expanded as such is. And Camus does this as well here. It's also typical of like Foucault and Heidegger. Now, the analytic tradition, just to give some contrast, does the opposite. In the analytic tradition, we do what's called conceptual analysis. We take a concept that like already exists, and then we draw distinctions to like make it clearer, right? So you're trying to like drill away the excess of a concept and get down to like the heart of what it's supposed to mean. And in the early analytic tradition, this meant relying on logic and grammar to elicit the meaning of a specific term, so that our language and what objects of language meant were supposed to be mathematical. And this strategy gets thrown out because it's really boring and dry and unhelpful and unsubstantiated, and redevelops itself to be something more abductive, like a kind of science. So like we're taking evidence and using the evidence to separate out our distinctions and to clarify concepts. And this is probably the philosophy that you're used to, right? So if you've taken other philosophy classes in our department, you'll have read works by philosophers who say, in this paper, I will argue this and this. And then they give you a premise, and they give you a premise, and they make an inference, and they give a conclusion, and they're very clear about everything specifically that they're doing, right? And this is just a different style of philosophy. And for a long time, I suppose now that I'm on the soapbox, may as well complete it. For a long time in the history of like philosophy, this distinction between the continental philosophers, the French and Germans and Eastern Europeans, right? Those philosophers and the analytic philosophers, those from the UK and America, who are doing this conceptual analysis stuff, clashed, and they saw themselves as doing opposite things, and they tried to invalidate the other, right? The continental philosophers accused the analytic philosophers of being dry and inhuman, right? Because all they're doing is stripping away the humanity from experience and from philosophy, which is supposed to be rich with experience and enrich our experience and our lives. And the analytic philosophers accuse the continentals of being obfuscating and confusing, of being absurd, right? Of spending 300 pages saying nothing, that sort of thing, right? Now, as the decades have gone on since like the 50s and 60s, in the last like 30, 20 years, the continental and analytic traditions have begun to merge. So there's all these arguments 10, 15 years ago coming from people in addresses to the APA and stuff, where they're saying, look, we should just get rid of these false boundaries between conceptual analysis and this continental strategy of like concept explosion, and see that like both have strengths and merge them together. And philosophy is already sort of doing that in its own dialectic sort of way. And And now into like mine and your generation of philosopher, we're seeing not just a compression of these two strategies in philosophy that's coming out, contemporary philosophy, but also in the issues that are dealt with. So like the continentals and the analytics deal with typically different questions. So continentals are interested in like the quality of being. So, okay, so for instance, this stuff, right, and like the question of being and the absurd takes the scientific turn with the rest of the world and becomes what's called enactivism or ecological psychology, where concepts and mental representation, perception is not necessarily to be defined by cognitive intentional objects, like what it's like to experience, but rather we can know things with our bodies, and it's our bodies that sort of are intelligent themselves, not necessarily with the help of like conceptual mind to operate and work in the world. Whereas the analytic cognitive scientists are saying everything has to do with objects of cognition and representation, and we're starting to see like a real blend of these two. Like, how does the intelligence of the body and the intelligence of the mind, how they interact and work together? So there's just another example. But you should be shocked if you haven't read philosophy like this before. And so what the purpose of today's lecture is to give structure and hopefully some scaffolding to get us on track with understanding what the hell Camus is saying in the myth of Sisyphus. So for that reason, it's going to be a little content heavy and a little less discussion based, but we'll be like reading through quotes and seeing like what we can derive from them and work our way through as we go on. Good. Okay. So the problem of suicide, right? This is the famous problem of the essay. As Camus begins, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of all philosophy. All the rest comes afterwards, which is a pretty bold claim, right? He's saying that nobody has talked about this question yet in seriousness, and all of the crap that, from like Parmenides and Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics through Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the medievals, Augustine and Descartes and his scholastics, and everybody up to 1940 whatever have been doing derivative work. Derivative of this question, which should be asked first, which is, why is life worth living? What is the meaning of life, and how do we derive meaning from life so that we can have a reason to answer any other interesting question that might strike us as philosophically inspired? Why live at all? And why is this the first question to be answered before all else, right? Why is this the important question? So Camus gives us a couple of examples. He says, look, I've never seen anyone die for the ontological proof, right? So the ontological proof, if you're not aware of it, is God is that than which no greater can be conceived, therefore God exists. It is my favorite argument in all of philosophy. It's so like beautiful and simple and confusing and strange all at once, and I love it. Here's it broken down. If you want to look at it, this is in the lecture slides posted to Canvas. So you can take a closer look at the ontological proof in more detail. They give you sort of some grip if that's something you're interested in. But nobody's ever died for the ontological proof. Like, who cares whether God is that in which no greater can be conceived if you have no reason to be here at all, right? It's the most theoretical, heady argument, proof for God's existence, and it does not motivate us to wake up in the morning. Right? Like, oh, I need to figure out the ontological proof. That's why I'm here today, right? Nobody's ever said that in the entire history of existence, right? And likewise with Galileo, Camus says, look, even Galileo, when he was impressed upon by the Spanish Inquisition, pretty quickly said, okay, I'll stop saying all the jerky stuff I've been saying about you scholastic academics being really stupid and doing terrible science and thinking that like the world is made of corpuscles. It's not made of corpuscles, says Galileo. Galileo was he was right about mechanical science and motion and gravity and the heliocentrism, right? But he was also an ass because he called the church stupid and everybody who thought that their doctrines were too stupid, like actively. So the Spanish Inquisition says, yo, we're going to kill you if you don't shut your trap. And so Galileo says, yep, okay, sure. And so what Camus says is like, look, like your greatest truth, the spirit of your entire life being scientific, as soon as you're threatened with death, like you can go quiet. Right? So what makes us go on living? What inspires us to wake up in the morning? What inspires us to do what we do? And what keeps us driving ourselves forward through time and through life is a matter of meaning, right? So why not just kill ourselves? Well, it's not for our science and our truth. It's not for things that are heady like the ontological proof. We need something more, something deeper, right? But it is hard to fix the precise instant, the subtle step when the mind opted for death. It is easier to deduce from the act itself the consequences it implies. In a sense, as in melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it. It is confessing that life is not worth the trouble. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. This is what suicide does. And Camus admits there are like honorable or noble suicides. So like a political suicide, instance of seppuku, right? And there are such things as suicide from reflection, where it's not a kind of confession, but a definitive act. So in the appendix, I think it is, Camus talks about Kirilov, who's a character from The Possessed or Demons, it depends how it's translated, the title, which is a novel by Dostoevsky. Kirilov is a really fascinating character who commits suicide reflectively, like out of purpose. And his speech is very absurd. It amounts to basically, no one has ever committed suicide as an act of like complete freedom. And so insofar as I do so, I enable the freedom of the whole rest of the world for the rest of history. And there's a kind of absurd argument going on there. And so this would be a kind of reflective suicide, which itself isn't a confession. It's like deliberately sought after, that sort of act. But these are incredibly rare, right? Are honorable and reflective suicides, when genuine and not the target of this essay and Camus' argument. What Camus wants to say, what Camus will argue, is that this kind of confession, the dying voluntarily, the giving in, the saying like, look, I'm just going to close up shop, right? That is not the right thing to do. So I say that carefully. Not a good or bad thing to do. It's not what Camus would say, right? He's not going to say like suicide is bad. He's going to say that suicide is just a kind of giving in, collapsing, losing grasp of oneself in the absurd through physical suicide. Now, there's also going to be philosophical suicide, which is an alternative form of distraction from the world, but suicide is to succumb to the distraction. And this is what Camus wants to say is like, look, there are other ways to live, to go on living, better ways that don't have us giving in to the distraction, to confessing our lack of meaning, the absence of reason, the daily agitation that we undergo, that we can overcome all of that, in fact. And we don't need to resort to suicide. So Camus wants to say that life is worth the trouble. So how do we get there? Okay, the absurd and its suicidal solution. So does absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide, right? So if the world is absurd, which Camus will take as sort of a premise, just like the world is through and through absurd. And in fact, the first essay in I suppose it's the second one, Absurdity and Suicide, Absurd Walls, gives us a series of examples in increasing strength that express the absurdity of the world. So does absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide? Does the absurd dictate death, right? The fact that our relationship to the world is one that's absurd, does that dictate the necessity that we kill ourselves, or that we like confuse ourselves out of recognizing the truth of it? Or is there another option? Or famously, as Camus is known to have said, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? What would lead someone to asking this question, right? Like what inspires this question in the first place? Well, again, it's facing the absurd. It's not clear to how to answer any why question. Why should I continue going on? Why should I wake up tomorrow? Why live at all? In the absurd, there is no reason that gives us inference, conclusion, and answer, right? There's only absurdity. The absurd is thick, and it's infinitely thick. It's all the way thick. There's no breaking through it. There's no finding some truth or answer that gives us what we need. It's not external. It's not out there to be found. It's something that we have to face, the thickness and impossibility of the absurd. Now, if the absurd is so thick and impossible, then suicide seems like the next best answer. Just, okay, there's no meaning, there's no reason, there's no ability to find meaning or reason, therefore I'm just sort of tired. See you later, right? Camus is going to give us another way through this answer, or through this problem. So what is the absurd? And if you've seen The Graduate, this scene I think is really excellently representative of it. Who's seen The Graduate, by the way? Dylan? Shane? So then you haven't seen, which half?
First half.
This is the second half. This is like the final scene. So basically what happens is the woman in the scene is like getting married, and Dustin Hoffman runs into the church and interrupts the marriage, and like in this romantic moment of passion and excitement says, everybody run away from all this, right? Come with me. And they like don't know each other. They like made some eye contact and flirted a little bit, right? And so Dustin Hoffman like takes her away, and she like swept up in passion. They sit at the back of the bus leaving the wedding grounds, and here they are slowly shifting into the reality as it settles in, and they realize, oh, we have nothing to talk about, right? Great works are often born on a street corner or in a restaurant's revolving door. So it is with the absurd. The absurd world, more than others, derives its nobility from that abject birth. In certain situations, replying nothing when asked what one is thinking may be pretense in a man, but those who are loved are well aware of this. But if the reply is sincere, if it symbolizes that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken, in which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it again, then it is, as it were, the first sign of absurdity. So does anybody want to try to interpret this quote? This is my favorite line from the whole essay. Love this line.
It's probably the one that stuck out to me the most, but now I don't want to try.
Anybody put in it? Yeah, Jason.
I don't know if this is an interpretation. Yeah, I'm just taking it at its face, but it's amusing that we still do this today, but when someone asks you what you're thinking about and you say nothing, we're all aware that usually that's a lie. We are thinking about something, we just don't want to tell the person what we were thinking about. But if you were really telling the truth and you were really thinking about nothing, then I guess Camus is saying that's like you're maybe you're recognizing the absurd somehow. If you were really thinking nothing, I don't know.
Yeah, so close. This is good. This is on the way there.
So I kind of interpret it going off of that. I kind of like the idea of like absurdity to me is like kind of like specifically the disparity between like one's goals and then like what actually happens or occurs in reality. or maybe like one's mental idea versus like materialistic possessions, for example. So the disparity between like what is expected and what actually occurs. And so I think this quote kind of shows those two things, right? Of what the individual's actually thinking and what they project onto others. And then to then connect those things is to connect the absurd.
Yeah, perfect. So, and as Camus says, the absurd is in the contrast, right? In any contrast of things, there is absurdity. And so you're exactly right that what this quote is doing is drawing a contrast between the great work and the abject poverty from which it comes, the revolving door, right? That inspiration strikes us, and you like J.K. Rowling was sitting on a train commuting home from work when she like had all of Harry Potter. Pretty boring, empty, like rote thing to be doing, commuting home on a train. And then here's this brilliant expression of youthful adolescent literature and magic and stuff. Now, the lover thing, right? So imagine like laying in bed with the person you love, or like on a roof with your best friend, and it's nighttime, summer nights, you're looking up at the stars, sort of thing. So you're like, what are you thinking? And say, nothing. Well, it's not that your head is empty. It's not that you're without thought, like as Jason said, it's not that we, when we say nothing, have nothing on our minds. It's just that there's nothing to be said, right? It's that the void has become eloquent, that our experience of the moment is so full of feeling and power, but there's no content to express it. And so there's nothing to be expressed, but there's so much that's being felt. And then here's, as Giancarlo points out, that there's a contrast, right? In the eloquence of the void and the inability to communicate, in the greatness of the work and its abject beginnings, right? Here is where we see the first signs of absurdity, little tiny contrasts like this. So the absurd is everywhere, especially in the small places just like this. It's every day, at all times. It's everywhere. It's thick. And we can hope for the future, but this is a forgetting of the present, right? To lose sight of the present is to think about the future. And this is a kind of distraction that Camus is going to tell us is no good for us. It's a turning away from the absurdity. So Camus is saying here that the absurd is everywhere, and gives us some examples later on. So there's this ubiquity to the fact, or the metaphysical state of absurdity. It's just a quality of being that is everywhere all the time. Shane.
It's gonna say, like, how do you think this relates to mindfulness? Because that's what had popped into my head when I read that last quote. It was like, he's kind of talking about mindfulness, but he's not. Like, to be sitting there not worrying about the future, or not thinking about an argument you had, or not just rehashing anything. That's like what mindfulness is. That's great. I'm sure he didn't like do that or practice that, but did that occur to anybody else? Buddha Shane at all? You're big into that. So is that what he means by, in that next slide, you said not worrying about the future, or can hope for the future, because we're getting. To embrace it, is that kind of the same like state of mind as mindful state?
I don't think so. I think it's a great question. What Camus thinks of asceticism, right? So like mindfulness, samadhi meditation, right? Where you're sitting there and focusing on the breath, right? Is to focus your attention and all of your like conscious attentive powers to the breath, such that the rest of the world sort of dissolves away and you are a single present thing. There's only the breath, right? And if you do this enough and deeply enough, you begin to sort of like ascend levels of conscious experience through the jhanas of it. And my thought, well, Camus doesn't address mindfulness, but there's a sort of focus on the present, which is similar in the Buddhist mindfulness practice and what Camus wants us to do, and becoming like fully aware of the absurd through the present. What I don't know is that in mindfulness, you're kind of abstracting away from the present to the point where like it's all like everything is an abstraction. That's like the purpose of the Eightfold Path and the Fourth Noble Truth is like we meditate, we work together, and we get rid of suffering because we see it's all an illusion. And Camus is more interested in reason than that. He's like thinking about the world. It's kind of an active thing. And so I'm not sure he would say that the world, reality, is illusory in the sort of way that a complete state of mindfulness, as recommended by the Buddhists, does. But you're right to see the similarity there. And I think it's an interesting direction to interpret and think, or like draw a contrast from Camus and his project. But I'm not sure what to say beyond the fact that it's interesting that there is a kind of contrast going on, and that the sort of presentness that Camus wants, which seems to be more rational and conceptual than the sort of aesthetic kind of just abstracting away. Okay, so the absurd is ubiquitous. But what is it? Well, perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what a degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate in us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees, at this very minute lose the illusory meaning with which we clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. For a second, we cease to understand it because for centuries we've understood in it solely the images and designs that we had attributed to it, beforehand because henceforth we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. It withdraws at us from a distance. What do we think of this? Does anybody want to interpret this one? Give it a shot. What does this mean? Ryan.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the way I took it was like, we kind of think of the world through like maybe like a lens of, well, first off, humans, we're always looking for meaning. It's just something that's like built into us. And so when we look at the world, we look at it through our human lens, which tries to attribute meaning to everything, tries to attribute some kind of purpose, some kind of function. But when that lens fails, we see that the world is not really for us, that there's kind of no meaning in the world. And it's totally separate from us. And there's like this big schism there that happens of the man who is looking for meaning, but can't find it anywhere in the world because it's just not there.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly right. I'll add to it. There's an extra piece that you sort of touched on, which is that like there's the human lens, right? But there's also our ability to like put on new lenses, right? And so when he's talking about like the irreducibility of the foreign stone, we can take on a scientific perspective and interpret what the stone is in so many different ways. Like for instance, change the example from a stone to a bristlecone pine, some of the longest living organisms on Earth. What happens with the bristlecone pine is as they live like 6,000 to 10,000 years, a branch will be alive for like 2,000 years, like it'll be growing for 2,000 years. And the genes at this part of the branch are different from the genes DNA at this part of the branch, right? That mutations have occurred in the new growth, distinct from the old growth. So how do we determine like what the individual is, right? And so what Kim was saying in the irreducibility of the foreign object, we can put on all of our different lenses and glasses, make scientific interpretations to say that the species or individual is whatever has the same genetic identity. That would mean that that like tree is not identical with itself, and so it's not an individual. Or maybe we can say that it's just like whatever the life form is, whatever has like grown from pine cone to like whatever that tree is, right? But then what about the other pine cones that it gives off that are genetically similar to it, right? That we can put on all sorts of different lenses, and at the end of the day, all of these lenses will that they won't completely capture the truth or the complete quality, reality of the object through which we are interpreting, representing, perceiving. And so nature remains irreducible to us. Now, what was exactly right in Ryan's comment was that there's a recognition of absurdity in this, right? That we feel the world evading us and becoming itself again, right? That the world withdraws from us. And there's in that space between this experience, this feeling of absurdity. But there's also the recognition that the world is something separate from us, right? That the world we perceive and our perceptions and ourselves, these are two objects, right? Two different things with a space in between filled with the absurd. Dylan.
Is the world withdrawing from us, or are we withdrawing from the world? Why would the world withdraw from us?
Yeah, would it make a difference one way or the other? What do you think? So like, is there a difference in quality?
Sure,
like,
it would make a lot of difference.
What's the difference?
If you're withdrawing from something, you're shutting it out. If the world's withdrawing, it's just leaving. You're not shutting it out.
Yeah. So the poetic language might be confused here. It may also be direct. So if the world is withdrawing from us, then there's something about the world that remains at a distance and keeps us at a distance. But it seems that Camus' point is only about us, because we only have access to our own perceptual faculties and like faculties of reason, and it's our own faculties of reason which reveal the irreducibility of nature, the distance between us and nature. So it does seem as if like the expression gives nature withdrawing, or ourselves withdrawing from nature, because it's us that recognize its irreducibility. But then the poetic expression at the end is nature seems to be pulling away from us. Jason, you had your hand up. You wanted to follow up on this thought?
I was just going to say, one of his points here is that we're locked into our own perspective in some way. And if you extend the metaphor, whether or not which party is drawing away, if we're locked into our own perspective, it would look the same. Like either way, it's just going to look like it's getting further away.
Yeah.
So the metaphor kind of works in that way, I think.
Yeah. So either it's withdrawing from us because we withdraw from it, and that's just how it looks, perhaps. Yeah, good. Ashley.
Yeah, same sort of idea, like in terms of physics, like when you jump off the earth actually is putting just as much force against you as you are against what's the same.
Yeah, the equal and opposite reaction thing, that the one withdraws and the other falls away.
If you were as big as the earth, then you would both move the same amount. It's just because the earth is so big.
Yeah, and it's a matter of perspective, which is going on. Let's do Olivia and then Giancarlo.
Yeah, so this whole discussion is kind of reminding me, and you mentioned Buddhism in the last slide, I think, but this reminds me of like the formlessness philosophy around Buddhism, that like nothing inherently has essence, and that the most true way to see things is like to not attach essence to it, and in that there's kind of like the detachment, but also like the connection of all things. So I don't know, I find this interesting.
Yeah, so the concept in Buddhism that you're touching up against is called interdependent origination, where in this like abstraction through insight or concentration meditation, you recognize that every feature of the world, though disparate, is like integrally connected with everything else, and that the causal connections of the cosmos are like butterfly affected, and that every ripple affects every other ripple, sort of thing. Yeah, so I suppose here's another contrast between sort of the Buddhist state of recognizing absurdity and and Camus, is that the Buddhists might not find the absurd state troubling, right? They just like become hyper aware of this interdependent origination of every object of existence and the thinness of objects of existence, and especially of our own consciousness of objects of existence, that our awareness is just an artifact and an illusion itself. That this is sort of expressive of the same kind of quality that Camus names the absurd, but for Camus it's a problem, right? It feels bad. right? I don't like this, says Camus. Whereas the Buddhist is like, great, we did it. We escaped suffering. Samsara, see you later. Moksha, adios, right? So that might be, I suppose, a development of the relationship between the two. For Shannon to be there.
Sorry, one more thing. I think it's interesting that you said that, because like I've heard a lot of people say that like Buddhism is kind of the antidote to like the absurd, and kind of like the problem that there was something else in my head, but I thought it was interesting the way you phrased that, because Buddhism has a lot of ways of viewing kind of the absurd in a more positive way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Giancarlo?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, if you could relate like this example of the absurd and like Plato's like idea of like forms and real patterns, where like an object in nature is greater than the sum of its parts, and it has that essence, and having that as an example of the absurd, where it's separated between like in a tree, there's a separation between just a trunk, a branch, a bunch of leaves, and some apples, and then the essence of it and the form that it actually makes up of an apple tree.
Good. Yeah. So Plato's theory of forms says that there exists this realm of forms out there, which is sort of like perfect concepts. There's like a perfect triangle and the perfect color green, and the concept, the form of a dog, right? And they're all just like in the heaven of forms. And things are good and statements are true insofar as there's an appropriate relation between the objects of existence and these forms. So like a triangle is a triangle insofar as it resembles the form of a triangle. An object is green insofar as it resembles the form of green. And if I say that this is an iPhone, then that statement is true if this object is representative of the essence of iPhone, the form, right? So I don't know if I have the quote in here, but Plato or Camus brings up Plato and this theory of essences when he's saying like, look, our reflections on the truth, on objects of nature, we find to be absurd, and there's no reconciliation in essences, Platonic essences and forms. There's no truth by which external to us we can hope for in this relation between what I think is the way the world is and this formal way that the world is perfectly. And so things aren't true because they relate to some external essence that makes them what they are. No, they're absurd all the way through. And at least he says that pretty explicitly, but at least in this quote, we might say like, look, even if there is, like, we don't have access to any of that. We can't see any of that. Our human experience is itself absurd, which we'll get to. So a quality of the absurd is not that it's just like a feature of nature, like a tree or a rock isn't absurd. It's our experience of the tree and rock that's absurd. It's the experience of our feeling that there's nothing to say when asked, what are you thinking? That's absurd. It's our relationship, the contrast between the human existence and the world in which the human exists, from which the absurd arises. And so even if there were some sort of Platonic form out there, that would not make our experience as humans any less absurd, because it is in the contrast of the external reality and the internal impossibility of getting through the irreducible thickness of that reality from which there is a relationship of absurdity. So this first quote is to say, what is the absurd? Well, the absurd is in nature, right? It's in our relationship to nature. We can't see it for what it is. Also, a man is talking on the telephone behind a glass partition. You cannot hear him, but you see his incomprehensible dumb show. You wonder why he is alive. This discomfort in the face of man's own humanity, this incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, is the absurd, right? Has anybody had an experience like this before? Maybe. Where you're looking in on someone's life from far away and you can't hear him, and you see him gesticulating and doing strange things, and surely saying something, that there's meaning to whatever's going on, but like we can't access it at all. It's like through a glass partition. It's just like watching this empty dumb show on the other side that certainly must have meaning, but like we can't see it, right? That it's the interrelation between ourselves and that world that breaks down, and we recognize again the absurd. So let's do Ruby and then Lux and then Colton.
Oh, I was just raising my hand to say, like, I have had an experience like that. Should I talk about it, or would it just take time with?
Will it add to, like, will it give philosophical?
Probably not, no.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just confirming, like, oh yeah, me.
Yeah, good.
And I realized I should probably put my hand down.
Same. I was just gonna say people arguing in the car.
Yeah, like you look into the other car on the highway and like, you know, but like how strange and silly is that? The incalculable tumble before the image of what we are, right? There's just an image of what we are, and you see it as an image. There's humanity there, but like there's no content to it. It's flat and two-dimensional. Yeah, good example.
Same here, along with those two, same here. But like when 20 minutes before class, when the people were dancing,
yeah,
trying to figure it out. So
yeah,
I came back around.
Yeah. Andrew.
Yeah, not to like completely overconflate it, but it kind of feels similar to like the way that like we sort of digest and experience like any form of art, like visual, auditory, like whether it be like movies or paintings or music. It's sort of all sort of gives us like a little bit of a piece of like of human existence, like even with like literature, where like we can get like a really, really in-depth detailed analysis of like a character's thoughts and how those like influence their actions. We're still experiencing it secondarily, like we're still experiencing it as an outsider reflecting in. And I don't know, like that kind of makes me like that feeling of the absurd that he's talking about. That's like the feeling of the absurd that I experience when I read something like, you know, Dostoevsky or Camus, or like these people who like are trying to like paint these really detailed pictures of like human experience. It feels like that really like visceral connection to the absurd, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. So like there are reported objects of meaning, works of art, people out there, things that are expressed that should come with content that sometimes we miss, or sometimes we translate through our own lenses of interpretation and perspective, and still recognize that like maybe this wasn't exactly what was expressed or presented, but it's like what I heard, right? And so again, there's this contrast, right? So what we get in this first expression of absurdity is the relationship with the world is absurd. And what we get with this expression of absurdity is that our relationship with the other is absurd, right? The other being a person, a work of art, whatever it is, that there will always be this space and contrast between our uptake and the expression of, right? And then finally, the mind's first step is to distinguish what is true from what is false. However, as soon as thought reflects on itself, what it first discovers is a contradiction. Whatever may be the plays on words and the acrobatics of logic, to understand is above all to unify. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal. The cat's universe is not the universe of the anthill. That's just like a cool quote that you should take home. The truism, all thought is anthropomorphic, has no other meaning. Likewise, the mind that aims to understand reality can consider itself satisfied only by reducing it to terms of thought. Does anybody want to try to interpret this one? I'll give you a shake.
Objective reality sits at like a distance from us, and when we were talking about like the lens before all thought is anthropomorphic, we cannot escape our human lens. Like there's different perspectives we can take, but they're all human. They're all human ways of thinking. And the lens will always distort objective reality, no matter how much we clean our lens or change it up or whatever. And the cat's lens will never be similar to the anthills or whatever it is. And that distance is where the absurd exists.
Yeah, perfect. So the difference then between this first expression and now this third expression is that this is something internal, right? That when we try to make truth in our own rational faculties, as they try to distinguish either through continental concept expansion or analytic conceptual analysis, like whatever form of thought and reason you're employing, that internally, as we have the object of perception, our intentionally represented vision before us, that even that breaks down into the absurd, right? That we find upon reflection of our own thought contradiction. Right? And so it's not only the world, reality, the external world, the other, and objects of meaning out in the world, but it's also our own internal worlds themselves, which upon reflection, the powers of reason only lead to incompleteness, irreducibility, absurdity, disconnection from, right? And in the space of disconnection, there's absurdity. Good. So reason hopes to unify, but never can. And here's the absurd. I said that the world was absurd, but I was too hasty. This world in itself is not reasonable. There's no reason in the world. They're just objects. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. It's just being dramatic here. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. For the moment, it is all that links them together. It binds them one to the other as only hatred can weld two creatures together. Right? Again, being dramatic. But here, Camus is saying that the absurd is a relation between the irrational is the wrong word, the like non-rational world, there's like not reason in the world, and the mind of reason, the human mind, which tries to like impose reason and unity and form and inference and concept upon that which is void of all of it, right? It is the absurd is the need, the human need to gather meaning from that which is meaningless. Okay, so back to the problem of suicide. What does one do in the face of the absurd? So, oh, Ashley.
I just wanted to mention with the word hasty, I really liked that word choice just because I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and the ends always say don't be hasty, and it really does connect because like the way that like as if like the world was like Lord of the Rings, just like enjoying the journey. It's really cheesy, sorry.
What's the mistake in being hasty?
I don't know. Not stopping to smell the roses, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So this will come up, I think, next week. But Camus might recommend being hasty at the expense of stopping to smell the roses, that his quantity over quality of experience is what's more important. And so that will come up and that'll be like a big thing. So keep that thought in mind because it's really important as we go forward. Yeah, Pierce.
So this is just an idea, question I had. So for Camus, does death help create meaning in the sense that like if we were immortal, or for Camus, is that the case?
Yeah, so again, we'll get there. This question gets dealt with as Camus is describing absurd freedom, which is the last section that we read for this week. So essentially what Camus is going to say is that yes, death is what gives us the sort of freedom, with the very specific kind of freedom which makes it capable to rebel against the absurd. But it's not itself death that makes things meaningful. It's death that creates the freedom that which when used makes life in rebellion against the absurd, which is qualified by death, meaningful. But that'll come. Okay, so what does one do in the face of the absurd? Well, they can hope through nostalgia, right? And nostalgia is not very clearly or at all defined in the myth of Sisyphus. It's worked out in others of Camus' essays, but nostalgia really roughly is just sort of like reason's will to unify, right? Like the desire to make sense of the world, and to look back on the past as having happened and as having been a part of this story that makes sense and communicates causally into the future. And so nostalgic thinking has to do sort of with unification of the world with ourselves, either through like the past having been meaningful or through the present looking forward to a hopeful future that is going to be meaningful, right? And so nostalgia is this kind of thinking that Camus will call philosophical suicide. But the other option in the face of the absurd is to be nihilistic. Okay, it's all absurd, so what the hell? Nothing brings me pleasure any longer, says Poe or something. Tum Tum, I don't know the Teletubbies names, but this you sort of feel sad that he's so cute. He doesn't feel pleasure any longer, poor guy. So if life can't be reconciled with existence, then willing nothingness may seem preferable to the fact of absurdity. Okay, so there are two kinds of suicide. There's philosophical suicide and physical suicide, where physical suicide is this nihilistic response to the absurd, and philosophical suicide, which is this nostalgic thinking, this use of hope to turn away from the absurd, to distract ourselves from the fact of its indefatigability, its thickness, its completeness in experience. But why does Camus think that clinging to hope in the face of the absurd is a kind of suicide, a philosophical suicide, as he calls it? And his ultimate answer is that it's a betrayal of reason, that reason will lead us to the absurd and no farther and always, right? But what nostalgic thinking does, and hope in philosophical suicide, is it says, look, reason can make a jump, it can make a skip, it can either jump into the absurd or past it, right? And this is to contradict the reason which ultimately and always leads to the absurd. And so philosophical suicide is going to turn out to be no good. It's a betrayal, and it's inauthentic. So authenticity is not a concept that we will cover in too much detail in this class. I think in Existentialism as a Humanism for 2 weeks from now, Sartre will bring it up. Authenticity is a really important existentialist concept. It's to use one's freedom in a way that like is respective of their dignity and of their power of reason, and to not like obfuscate or lie to oneself. It's to like live in virtue of what one's passion is, and to have one's passion be directed by this like awareness of the absurd condition, all that sort of stuff. So to betray reason, to make these philosophically suicidal leaps, and to do away with reason is to act inauthentically. So the struggle against the absurd implies a total absence of hope, which has nothing to do with despair. The absence of hope contrasted with despair. Despair is not the same thing as an absence of hope. Absence of hope good, despair bad. A continual rejection, which again is contrasted with renunciation. So continual rejection and renunciation, two different things. Renunciation to be nihilistic, rejection to rebel, which is a good thing. And a conscious dissatisfaction, which is compared with immature unrest. So immature unrest and dissatisfaction are going to be different. And this might be a point of contention between Sartre and Camus, maybe historically speaking. So everything that destroys, conjures away, or exercises these requirements and ruins the absurd and devalues the attitude that may then be proposed. The absurd only has meaning insofar as it is not agreed to. And here we have the secret sauce, right? Camus' secret sauce. Here's how we respond to the absurd: is we don't agree to it. We rebel against it. And rebellion will involve an absence of hope, contrasted from renunciation, a continual rejection, contrasted from, hope, despair, rejection from renunciation, and conscious dissatisfaction, contrasted from immature unrest. These are going to be our ingredients that allow us to find meaning through rebellion against the absurd. And anything that has to do with despair, renunciation, immature unrest, hope, and nostalgia, these will be philosophical suicides because they undermine our ability to rebel authentically, completely, with full awareness of the absurd all the time. So what Camus does now in the following section of the essay is he addresses other people who have faced absurd thinking and have themselves commit philosophical suicide. So he gives us examples. And one of his examples is Chestov. One of his examples is Kierkegaard. Nietzsche, he says, has it right. And another one of his examples is Husserl. So we'll talk about these. What are the examples and how do these people commit philosophical suicide in spite of their absurd thinking? So Chestov represents the mystics. He was sort of a Russian existentialist and mystic, Orthodox Christian kind of guy. So when at the conclusion of his passionate analyses, Chestov does not say, this is the absurd, but rather Chestov says, this is God. We must rely on him even if he does not correspond to any of our rational categories. This is the mystic sort of conception that our reason, our faith, our theology, our general experience of the world, theistic or not, leads us to the absurd. In the case of the mystics, the absurd becomes God, right? And this is what Chestov is saying. So absurdity is God, and we must rely on that absurdity, even if it does not correspond to our rational categories. God is beyond us. God is the absurd, but let us rely on him anyways. So the idea here is that at the bottom of all inquiry, questioning, and discovery, there are further gaps, right? A God of the gaps, that wherever you look, there's always more questions to be asked. And people say, whoa, God is just that thing that is the mystery that's left over. There's always mystery. Always absurd. This is what God is. This is a kind of philosophical suicide. The single unifying mystery of all is absurd, but rather than call it absurd, Chestov calls this unification God. And with this leap, Chestov attempts not to prove the absurd, but to dispel it, right? To give us reason to love it or have faith in it or something. And Camus takes issue with this. He argues that unifying the absurd so that every instance of it, every instance of mystery, every instance of a gap between empirical inquiry or reasoning and reality, right, where like this mystery and absurd reveal themselves. Every instance of this gap being unified with every other instance, wherever there's mystery, it's all the same thing. It's just God sort of like appearing in different ways, right? That this is a mistake, right? That it's a kind of leap in reason, that if it's mystery, we don't know that it's the same as any other mystery because it's obfuscated from us. We can't say that two patches of empty black space are unified, even though they share all of, as far as we can tell, they share all of the same properties, right? So like if you're looking into two, there's a cube here and a cube here, and there's no light that passes through the cube, and you look into it, and it's just like pure blackness, and it's pure blackness over here too. They share all the same perceptual properties. It's just mysterious. We don't know what's inside. Doesn't mean that we can unify them. We might want to and say like, look, the mystery is the same thing. It's sort of a mystic expression. But this is a mistake. As Camus says, if there is an absurd, it is in man's universe, not in the mysterious one. The moment the notion transforms itself into eternity's springboard, it ceases to be linked to human lucidity. Man integrates the absurd, and in that communion causes to disappear its essential character, which is opposition, laceration, and divorce. This leap is an escape because the leap attempts to unify. It attempts to put together things that are disparate and not meant to be put together. They are instances of absurd, but just because they are absurd does not make them the same. And their disunification is its own kind of absurdity. It's to escape the absurdity, the fact of disunification, of instances of mystery and absurd that is turned away from when they're unified. So reason is useless, and for Chestov, there is something beyond reason, which is the absurd, which is God, and the unification of the absurdity in the acceptance of the fact of God is uncovered by the uselessness of reason. Reason only gets us to the absurd in every instance, and so that must get us to God, says Chestov, but that's an extra jump. That's not inferred by something rational. To infer that something is beyond the uselessness of reason is itself to use reason, right? But that's a contradiction. And so Camus concludes, to an absurd mind, reason is useless, and so there's nothing beyond it. To Chestov's mind, reason is useless, and so reason shows us God, right? There's an extra inference, there's an extra step, right? There's an extra piece of the puzzle that's being added on to make sense of it all. But to the absurd mind, as Camus sees it, that only allows like this lucid perception of itself and the absurdity that it sees. Reason only sees its own uselessness. It adds nothing more. So we read Kierkegaard. So hopefully this was a little bit clearer, Camus' interpretation of Kierkegaard. So like Chestov, Kierkegaard also takes a leap, right? The leap of faith, that the infinite movement of resignation leads itself to the dance of faith, in which the absurd is leapt into and the absurd will resolve all contradictions, i.e. through God, all things are possible, right? We should remember this from Fear and Trembling. So for Kierkegaard, the leap of faith is an acceptance of the absurd. It's to use the absurd, to leap into it, to have faith in it, to resolve those contradictions, like the murder sacrifice of his only trueborn son, Isaac. One infinitely resigns oneself to the world, then willfully leaps into the absurd, embracing it with his whole heart. Through God, all things are possible. Maybe the leap of faith would be an acceptable answer, but as Camus says, there is no logical certainty here, because the leap of faith moves beyond reason. We can't like know by reason that taking a leap of faith will be good for us, right? That by taking the leap of faith, the knife won't just plunge into the heart and breast of our young son, Isaac, right? Nor is there any experimental probability either, says Camus. Like, it's not by like some a priori reasoning that you can decide to, you know, plunge the knife and know that all will be fine. Nor are most instances, in fact, all instances of plunging the knife into your child saved by the angel and you know, replaced with a lamb. So empirically speaking, if you're gonna like murder sacrifice your son's probably gonna die, right? That this just is the way the world works. And so neither a priori reasoning nor a posteriori empirical like fact of the world gives us any sort of evidence to say that a leap of faith will resolve the contradictions, as Kierkegaard says it does, right? And that's why it's a leap of faith, of course, which is, you know, Kierkegaard's answer to the absurd. But for Camus, reason is all we got, right? Either a posteriori or a priori. And so if I do not draw a negation from the absurd, at least I do not want to found anything incomprehensible, like the leap of faith. Like, I don't know what the content of that is. And whatever content I can get is either empty, because a priori I don't know what it means, or a posteriori, it's just that like the contradiction I hope to resolve resolves itself in the worst way. My son gets murdered. Therefore, I want to know whether I can live with what I know and with that alone. Using useless reason, can that be enough? Okay, and then finally, the philosophical suicide of Husserl, who represents sort of empirical science generally. So Husserl was a phenomenologist. He was like the first phenomenologist. And Husserl, his project in a nutshell is to make a science out of human experience. So phenomenology is the study of what it's like to have an experience of something. So my phenomenology of this cup is as having a certain weight, is being a certain size, is having a sort of roundness and a creamy whiteness color, right? And my phenomenology is something that's private to me. And all of these properties, these perceptual properties, are what are called representations, intentional objects. Intentional here, intentionalism is a term of art. It's not meant to be like, I mean to do this or I mean to do that. It has a different meaning in like this context. Intentionalism is that there's some object in my mind, which is an object of perception, which is given to me by the material thing in the world that I'm perceiving. So I don't perceive the material thing in the world, which would be in philosophy of perception, that's like naive realism. It's like what we perceive is just the world. Intentionalism or representationalism says, no, the object in the world interacts with our mind and our perceptual faculties to create intentional objects or representations of what's out in the world. And so we don't ever access the world. We only ever access what is represented in our minds, right? And Husserl wants to say that we can scientifically categorize and objectify these phenomenological intentional objects that are represented to us, and thus get like a whole science of human experience. Okay, so talked about that. Camus is okay with this theory of perception. This is still the going theory of perception. There's all sorts of different theories of perception, but like that representationalism, intentionalism is like the dominant one, and was developed around this time, like 1940s, 1950s. And so Camus accepts this, that consciousness represents features of the world which are unified under a rational pretext, right? That when I pick up this object, I like understand what I'm doing. Like I grasp my hands in the right sort of way. I feel it as a rectangle that insofar as I perceive it, I'm categorizing it in a human way. I'm putting it through a lens, right? And the revelation of this pretense is absurd, right? Because we see the object of representation being distinct from the material as what Kant would call the noumenal, the object in itself, as opposed to phenomenal, which is the object as we experience it. We recognize the difference between these things, and there's a pretense of absurdity. However, if what we represented was either the world in itself or otherwise consistent with some essential a priori mental constructs, this is where we get the discussion of Plato and this theory of forms, then our representations, those intentional objects that are an affect of experiencing the world, would not be so absurd, because they would either be consistent with the perfect triangle, the form of the iPhone, whatever, right, the platonic things, or if there's some a priori set of like complete human experiences that we can scientifically, empirically measure, categorize, map out, then any experience that we have just like fits into that, that categorization map. And so then there's no difference between what a representation ought to be and what the representation is. But Camus doesn't think this is the case, that the human experience, it goes beyond the ability to analytically map out representations. And in fact, the world goes beyond our capacity to see it. Okay, so in order to do a science of human experience, you would need some control measurement, some stable environmental factors upon which natural scientific laws can be derived. But there are no Platonic forms hidden away. There's no extra temporal entities through whom judgments about the nature of consciousness can be justified, nor is everybody's experience unified, right? Everybody has their own individual experience. Nagel, who, if you read the paper on absurd, has a really famous paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat, where, and it's a beautiful paper, it's wonderful. He basically argues very convincingly that all phenomenology is essentially private and that we can't access the phenomenology of other people, that there is some degree of solipsism which is necessitated by the human experience. And this is what Camus is getting at when he's saying that, look, phenomenology and empirical justification is all abduction, inference to the best explanation, which itself is a kind of skip in reason, something Hume would be unhappy with. And so science, and especially that of consciousness, attempts to abstract from experience to truth. And if experience is disunified, experience itself is a disunity across instances of experience, and even within experience itself, right? Our experience of an object is different from the object and without our experiencing it. Or instances of people's experience of the same object will be disunified. Then we can't abstract from any of that to truth. We can maybe get a strong correlation, which is the best that science gives us. But again, to infer from strong correlation to causal property is a mistake. It's something that goes beyond reason. It's a form of philosophical suicide. Just as much a leap in that same way as Kierkegaard and Chestov's. Okay, so some arguments so far. One, humankind requires that the world be meaningful. This is our nostalgic thinking. We have this nostalgic property, which is just a quality of what we are. But at bottom, the world is meaningless, a rationality of nature, right? And this is troubling for us. This is the absurd, right? So the absurd is there, and this is a problem. The absurd is a relation between us and the world. Another argument, in the full light of the absurd, life is meaningless. There's no reason to live a meaningless life. Therefore, we ought to commit suicide, physical, philosophical, whatever floats your boat. But this is for philosophical suicide. Is there another way through this mess of the absurd? So if we take the absurd, as Camus said, to be ubiquitous, thick all the way through, and reason becomes useless in either giving us answers to the need for meaning, the problem of finding meaning, right? Nor nor should we commit suicide of one sort or the other, then what's our option? It seems like we're between the horns of an antinomy, right? Where one of the horns is kill yourself or forget that things are bad for you, right? That the absurd is a thing. And that's all there is. If reason is useless and there's nothing we can do about it, and everything is absurd all the time, then our options are one or the other. But Camus trying to tell us we don't have to accept either of these options. We can shoot the horns. Right? So what gets us through the mess? Radical acceptance and absurd freedom, and this brings us to the end of the essay. So if I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have meaning, or rather this problem would not arise. For I should belong to this world. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. I cannot cross it with a stroke. I cannot cross it out with the stroke of a pen. What I believe to be true, I must therefore preserve. What seems to me so obvious, even against me, I must support. And that constitutes the basis of that conflict, of that break between the world and my mind. But the awareness of it, if therefore I want to preserve it, I can through a constant awareness, ever revived, ever alert. So this is what Camus, the first step of Camus' answer to split the horns of the antinomy between physical and philosophical suicide is to preserve the absurdity, which is at the end of all reasoning, at the end of all experience, to preserve it through a lucid and complete awareness of it, right? This is what we must do. We must, even if it's against us, right? It is what there is. And if it's what seems so, we can't turn our eyes away from it just because we don't like it to be so. And this will be sort of like the first ingredient of our response, our Camusian response to the absurd. So the first step to overcoming the problem of suicide is to remain lucidly aware. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd only dies when we turn away from it. Another sort of beautiful poetic quote. So Eurydice is the wife of Orpheus, and she dies, and Orpheus is really sad. And he goes to Hades and plays beautiful music that convinces Persephone and Hades to allow Persephone or allow Eurydice to return to the world of the living on the condition that for the extent of the time that they are walking out of Hades, Orpheus doesn't turn around and look at Eurydice. But at the final moment, like Orpheus walks through the portal and back into the real world, and like he's beginning to doubt that Eurydice is behind him because he hasn't seen her this whole time. And so he gets nervous and turns around because she hasn't come through the portal yet. And just as she's stepping through, he sees her and disappears, gone forever. Right? So the absurd only dies when we turn away from it, right? As opposed to Eurydice, who dies when you look at her. That's what that means. So suicide, like the leap, is acceptance in the extreme, which gives us what Camus calls his first consequence. That revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. Consciousness and revolt, these rejections are the contrary of renunciation. Everything that is indomitable and passionate in a human heart quickens them, on the contrary, with its own life. It is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is repudiation. The absurd man can only drain everything to the bitter end. The absurd is his extreme tension, which he maintains constantly by solitary effort, for he knows that in that consciousness and in that day-to-day revolt, he gives proof of his only truth, which is defiance. Does anybody want to interpret this one? What's Camus saying? He gives proof to his only truth, which is defiance. Shane.
I thought this one reminded me of the Seven Seal dude, who, when met with death, was like defiant to the very end and was like, "Screw you! Like I lived the way I wanted to live to the very end." That's kind of what I think this is saying. Is that like
Like Kierkegaard, like you look at the abyss, like the darkness, and you can almost like you can jump in or you can turn away. But Camus wants us to just like stare it in the face and keep looking, but not jump, not turn away, just keep looking at the absurd.
Yeah,
like
exactly, right? What does the squire say? Do not turn away, face death with your eyes open, right? I accept my fate, but I rebel against it, right? That he's being a Camusian absurd hero. Yeah, perfect. Pierce.
It's almost, it's like finding meaning and saying like F you, that there's only two concepts. Either you accept that life will be or you say, no, screw you, I'm gonna do it anyway. Almost, it's like how what he's arguing, like don't like just say screw it and do it, even though you know like it's almost like when you feel proud of yourself when you rebel against a parent, almost like you did something because you stood up for yourself.
Yeah, good. So it's not just one middle finger, it's two. It's like there's the absurd, but also go yourself, right? And it's in defiance that we keep clear sight of our enemy, right? It's when you're hyper aware of the movements of your enemy is when you are most defiant and rebellious against their efforts. And so to be lucidly aware of the absurd is to remain defiant against it, is to rebel against it, is to give it the big middle finger, right? Is to say, I am aware of you and I reject you, though you are all there is at the end of every point of reason.
Oh, I was thinking of it in the context of Nietzsche. I mean, first it's really blatant, but yeah, he's just like, put the boxing gloves on and step into the ring with the absurd. But I like I think even like similar to Nietzsche where God is done and you need to the value makers. And you almost have this absurd God is dead, and you go through your value makers, like your way of rebelling his life is like you just love painting or whatever. And like I'd even say that's rebelling against the absurd and giving yourself the value is living in pain or whatever.
Perfect. So the three consequences from Camus' reflections on absurdity and our relationship to it. The first is to affect it with defiance and this lucid awareness. The second is to use our freedom to act defiance, not just think it, but to live, to do works in the world that are defiant of the absurd, to exercise that freedom, which is itself absurd because we all die. Right? And the third is to do those works consistent with our passions. Right? So to value create, and whatever your value is to have a passion for doing works, and if they are done exercised in defiance of the absurd, this is what makes you Camus' absurd hero, which will be the subject of next week's lecture. The second half of the myth of Sisyphus gives us 3 solid examples of people who do this, that act in defiance. And we'll talk about the other 2 consequences. Ashley, you had your hand up.
So kind of if you're floating down a river and the current coming at you is absurdity, then be you have to swim against the current to overcome it. And the first step towards that is acknowledging that there is a current. So that it won't sweep you away.
Yeah, which is, I think another just it's on my mind now since Shane and Olivia brought it up, the Buddhism stuff. If anybody's read Hesse's Siddhartha, at the end the big spiritual lesson is be like the bark that floats on the river. This is another distinction then between the Buddhist sort of mindfulness and Camus' lucid awareness of the absurd. Camus says swim upstream, opposite of bark on the river, right? So you're right, and maybe the defiance is the fuel, right? That gives you energy to exercise your freedom to swim upstream. Second consequence. Third consequence, your passion. You like freestyle or breaststroke, right? So exactly so. It's a good metaphor. Where are we here? Yeah, so the absurd is troubling, but don't let it win. Revolt, rebel, be defiant, become lucidly aware of it, and live in spite of it. Yeah, Pierce?
So my isn't Sisyphus the character who has the boulder? And so is like the argument something along the lines of we're all pushing our boulder, and no matter what we do, it doesn't matter. But we're gonna say F it anyway and keep pushing the boulder.
Yeah, and with the right perspective, our fate can become free and defiant of that fate, and so meaningful, and full.
Sisyphus's life is blandly meaningless. Rolls the boulder up the hill just for it to fall down. But he still finds meaning in it.
Yeah, by rebelling against his fate. So from a perspective of rebellion, the absurd is like he must push the boulder up the hill, and it rolls back down, he pushes it back up. Sisyphus was a beguiling, cunning, tricky dude who died and then tricked the gods into letting him go back into his body. And because he wanted to like get back at his wife or something, or tell her, I don't remember exactly, tell her he loved her or get back at her, I can't remember which one. And he just never does that. And so he gets to like live forever. And Zeus is like pissed that he like pulled the wool over me. And so kills him again, and then punishes him for defying his will. Zeus is not a god you want to defy the will of, especially if he's in the form of a duck. That's or goose, bad sign, run away. Yeah, so Sisyphus's punishment is to like push the boulder up the hill. And this is supposed to be a story representative of the absurdity that we are all faced with day to day, waking up day after day, living, dying, sort of either from an individual or holistic perspective of humanity. And that with the proper perspective, that this fate, which is decreed to go on forever, can itself become meaningful, that even the most meaningless existence, which is the Sisyphusian existence, can itself be made meaningful if that fate is rebelled against, if Sisyphus is defiant, and if Sisyphus loves his boulder, right? One must imagine him happy, but that is to get ahead of ourselves for next week. So how does one revolt against the absurd? Well, they freely will to live in spite of it, right? And they will to live not just physically, but also in spite of it, right? To not commit philosophical suicide, to face it head on. So what is freedom for the absurd hero? Well, it's nothing special. God doesn't give us freedom. Otherwise, God would not be all powerful. And it's a bit of a paradox thing that Camus brings up. Nor is freedom, as Camus conceives of it, anything metaphysically robust, right? We don't have, as far as anything matters, we don't have like this property of free will in us that allows us to do what we do, right? We are each slaves to life, condemned to death, right? We are Seneca was the Roman slave who said like, look, I'm not in control of my actions, but at least I have like this reflective ability to be in control of my interactions, my feelings about the world that I interact with. And Camus says something similar of the slave, that the slaves of the Roman Empire had a sort of freedom from responsibility, that the things that they do are not their fault, right? Because they are directed to do them, but their freedom is in their perspective of their actions as not responsible, right? As being enslaved and revolting against that slavery, though following through the actions that the slave master tells them they must do. So freedom is kind of like this in each of us, insofar as we live and we die, our actions are ultimately determined by an eventual death, to become meaningless themselves, to be forgotten. We all wash away, dust to dust, etc. Right? So freedom is used to permit actions for the sake of some end, but with death always looming, there are no ultimate ends for actions. Death is the only ultimate end. So the absurd, as Camus says, enlightens me on this point. There is no future. Henceforth, this is my reason for my inner freedom. So freedom is a kind of feeling, right? Like that. And though illusory, a valuable asset insofar as it allows liberation from an absurd fate through an acceptance of it, an awareness of it, a continued awareness of it, and defiance against it. The slaves of antiquity did not belong to themselves, but they knew that freedom which consists not in feeling responsible. Death, too, has patrician hands which, while crushing, also liberate. This is a fun quote. Freedom is not the power to do otherwise or willful moral force, but rather an affective liberation from the absurd by approaching the absurd in the right way, that is, with lucid awareness, defiance, with rebellion. So the second consequence, the absurd man thus catches sight of a burning and frigid, transparent and limited universe in which nothing is possible, but everything is given, and beyond which all is collapse and nothingness. He can then decide to accept such a universe and draw from it his strength, his refusal to hope, and the unyielding evidence of a life without consolation. How about this one? Someone want to take a shot at this? So just sort of talked about it, but what's your take? Second consequence. Cool.
Life is contradiction. That's why I kind of get from this, because it's like burning and frigid, transparent, limited. Everything's possible. Nothing's possible, and everything's given. It just seems like a give and take kind of thing, where you're constantly going back and forth.
Yeah, the reason only ever gives us contradiction, but in order for there to be contradiction, you need antinomy. You need the proposition of premises to run against one another, right? And so I think what Camus is getting at here is that freedom is something like what gives the premises that become contradictory. And so freedom is to continue giving those premises, is to continue giving experience, and in giving experience, recognizing and seeing and feeling, being in the absurd, and to continue giving those premises that those experiences, what I call them, in a defiant manner, in a way that says, I'll do this in spite of what it ultimately always becomes, because it ultimately always becomes that, right? And so freedom it's a necessary feature of our being, of our existence, of our quality of life that we perceive, like we just automatically perceive. It just happens to us, right? And it's in this quality of nostalgic thinking that drives us to unify the affects, the affordances of perception. And they always result in contradiction, which gives us the absurd. This activity of perceiving and unifying and contradicting is what can take on the quality of freedom to be done defiantly, even though it must always happen. And so this is sort of a strange two-dimensional thin notion of freedom, but seems to be enough for Camus to give him the sort of hero that he's looking for, that commits neither form of suicide, right? That shoots the horns.
So
yeah, Giancarlo.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but it's kind of made me think of like bottom of page 38, where he talks about Kierkegaard making the leap of like essentially trying to escape the antinomy that you were talking about, where it's like Kierkegaard wants to be cured in his frenzied wish, and it runs throughout his whole journal. The entire effort of his intelligence is to escape the antinomy of the human condition, and all the more desperate efforts since he intermittently perceives its vanity when he speaks of himself, as if neither fear of God nor piety were capable of bringing him to peace. So like that would kind of be an example of someone else who is attempting to escape that contradiction of the human experience. And Camus is basically trying to do the complete opposite, where you embrace it as a meaning of life. And hence he brings in Sisyphus, who has taken this futile task and taken this, quote unquote, terrible existence that he's been burdened with, and flips it on its head and says, you know, through this, I find purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Just so. What Kierkegaard is doing, what Kim was accusing him of, is committing philosophical suicide, because they're always looking to escape the absurdity and the hopelessness of the distance between man and his God, and so does so with faith. But this is to resolve the contradictions that give way to the absurd by using the absurd, which is itself as a jump of reason, and so no good, right? And I don't know if you guys recall this, but in Fear and Trembling, part of what we read, Kierkegaard says, look, I'm not a knight of faith myself, but I'm always like running around looking for him, right? I spent a whole lot of time traveling all over the place, and if I did find one, I'd follow him and do whatever they did all the time, so that I could be like them as well, at least the character. And so Kierkegaard is admitting a kind of weakness that what at least that character, Johannes de Silencio, is admitting to the reader is that he recognizes the absurdity which comes with infinite resignation, with renunciation, right? And wants it to not be that way anymore, which is why he's looking for knights of faith, and why he would do whatever a knight of faith would do to get there himself, right? And so what Camus is pointing out is that, yeah, in these passages like that, even though Kierkegaard is oftentimes presenting contradictory ideas through his different pseudonyms, we talked a little bit about that too, that you can kind of get this as a spirit common to much of Kierkegaard's writing, that Kierkegaard himself recognizes this absurdity and is like hoping for some way out of it. This is philosophical suicide. But this is also a mistake, just as you said. Good comment. So, second consequence. So live in rebellion against the absurd in order to be your fully true self, authentically accept the absurd and be liberated from the tension it occurs. But what does this sort of life look like, and how can this sort of life become meaningful? So Camus has prescribed to us rebellion and defiance. He's told us that rebellion and defiance are possible through the use of freedom, though it is absurd freedom, as he calls it. But what does it look like, and how does what's the mechanism of action? So like, if the metaphor that I'm using here is like a pill, then Camus says, here, take this pill, it's called defiance. And what defiance does is you can take defiance as long as you're acting with absurd freedom. And what defiance does in your body, its mechanism of action, is to make life meaningful. So what is the actual content of that mechanism of action? Will?
A bit off, but I'm just thinking a bit about like the context of the stranger now. So is Marcellus someone is like in like this purgatory of like should probably just kill himself because he's not like philosophically suicided, like he knows the absurd is there. But he's not exactly Camus, where he's like, oh, like it's all sick and stuff. Like I'm rebelling against the absurd. So you think he's like ready to be in like this like purgatory?
Until the end. So the very last passage on 64 and 65 of the Myth of Sisyphus talks about Meursault as a character who only has full power in the condemnation of his death, right? Because the condemnation of death, the like coming of dawn, is supposed to be like the coming of life, or the coming of death in life, and that's where he gets his freedom. And then it's only being so impressed upon by his condemnation of death that Meursault finally wakes up to the absurd. Right? He finally wakes up. He's lucidly aware of the cool indifference of the world, of the signs and the stars, right? And it's from this state that Meursault says, no one had the right to tell Maman that she couldn't start all over again. This is to be defiant of that state, and to say that all I need wish is for the day of my execution to come and there be a crowd of hateful cries that accompany me to the gallows, and I should call myself happy. That this final exposition is a result of his passion, right? Of the sort of meaning that comes from this perspective to freely recognize and become lucidly aware of the absurd, that any perspective that gives meaning to that, whether it be good or bad in like normal moral categories, is enough to satisfy rebellion, which is, we might find problematic, right? That any meaningful reaction to the absurd is enough as long as it's done from a place of lucid awareness and in defiance of the absurd. So if it's hateful cries that get you off and give you that like strength of human power to say, screw you, absurd, I'm living in spite of you and I see you fully and completely, then that's good for Camus, right? Is it being the Don Juan and loving so many people? Is it being the general who like leads men and you know, lives nobly or whatever? It doesn't matter, right? Because all moral categories and all human vocations are going to turn out to be absurd anyways. So whether it be hateful cries leading to the gallows or entertaining many lovers or living nobly, this is all enough, right? As long as it's done freely and in defiance of the absurd. So what gives this absurd hero who's acting freely and in defiance of the absurd their vigor and spirit, their ability to swim upstream? What is the active force of the raison d'etre, right? It's passion, and this is the third consequence. So to live as much life as there is to be lived, this quantity thing, right? In full quantity, because every moment lived is one lived in rebellion against the absurd. And every moment of rebellion against the absurd is better than less moments of rebellion against the absurd. And here we get a little bit of this quantity quality thing, that why stop to smell the roses if it means getting shot? Live on 20 years, whatever it takes, rebel against the absurd. That seems to be enough for Camus. How exactly this works is unclear at this point. We'll see examples of it in next week's reading. But the idea is that what's left in the lucid acceptance and rebellion against the absurd is your passion, who you are, what you are as a person. From Schopenhauer as educator, we might think of the passion as that sort of thing that you look back on your life and you find the principle that has unified all of the things that have made you happy up to that point, and you let that be the principle of your life henceforth, right? Similar sort of thing. This is your passion. I already had that slide there. And living in light of that spirit of passion is the third consequence. Thus I draw from the absurd three consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. What the life of an absurd hero looks like, and how, in light of these three consequences, they're able to live, is dealt with in the second half of the book, which we will read for next week. And that's the end. So, Giancarlo, you had a final thought?
Yeah, super quick. I just can't stop thinking about like the alternative, like in Sisyphus, or like the example of swimming upstream, like to completely accept a lack of purpose and to say that your passion is, you know, let's say that Sisyphus never got sent away to Hades and to push the rock up, and he was just some normal guy, and he said, I'm just going to live on the beach for the rest of my life and drink wine and party, and he just decides that's how he's going to live his life passionately. Would that be a form of philosophical suicide because you're failing to, it's a like an incorrect way to explain the separation between a human's drive for purpose and the lack of purpose that exists?
Yeah, this is a great question. Camus brings this up, sort of, when he says that the person who has recognized the absurd is stuck, that as soon as you've seen it, you can't unsee it, right? And so to flop away into hedonism as such is a kind of philosophical suicide. It's a turning away from, says Camus, because it's to like find pleasure and meaning in things that are just as absurd as anything else, and to like not see them as absurd, to like lose that lucid awareness. Now, we might also think that ignorance is bliss for just the same reason. And if that's the conclusion, then sorry guys, you're now all aware. And so good luck, have fun rebelling. Defiance and passion and freedom, exercise it. And we'll see examples of that next week. So just to sort of wrap up then, hopefully this was helpful in like deciphering the quotes and like seeing the form of argument played out. Coming back to the second half of the reading, hopefully it's a little bit better, and hopefully like we know sort of what Camus is on about. And so in seeing like these ideas put into like life by his examples, and then the like metaphor of Sisyphus given back to, or the what's the word for it? The allegory of Sisyphus given back to us will sort of help to clarify. Now, if it doesn't, and you're having trouble, I'm absolutely happy. I would actually really enjoy sitting down with you guys again outside of class time to chat through passages and work through the ideas. This is like one of my all-time favorite books. I absolutely love it. So if it's something that you're interested in learning more about and knowing more about, then we can take a deeper dive. I'd be happy to do that. And if there's several of you, then maybe we schedule something. But if it's not, and it sucks, and you just force yourself through it, then existentialism as a humanism will be a much clearer and happier exemplification of these existentialist concepts. Because Sartre is giving that lecture to like a audience, and it's like spoken word, and it's very lucid and clear. So good luck with next week, and we'll finish the essay. So see you then. Yeah, Dylan?
Well, I thought The Stranger was real good to read. It was an enjoyable read. It was quick, and it had a message. This one was very confusing in the beginning. Now I've started the second half, and he's gone back more like The Stranger, where it's clear and more understandable.
Yeah.
So his writing changes from one to the other.
It goes from poetic to exemplified, and it gets clearer. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Giancarlo, final thought?
I just had a question for you after class. Could you stick around in the Zoom? Awesome. Thank you.